Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Changing Nature of Crime and Criminal Investigations webinar. This webinar is hosted by the Bureau of Justice Assistance National Training and Technical Assistance Center, BJA NTEC. At this time, I've placed all phone lines on mute mode, so if you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of our presentation. My name is Tanya Bowie, and I'm a communications specialist with BJA NTEC, and we're pleased to have the Police Executive Research Forum today with us. I would like to introduce our panelists today from the Police Executive Research Forum, also known as PERF. First, we have Kevin Morrison. He is currently PERF's Chief Operations Officer and has worked extensively on use of force issues since joining PERF in 2015. He's spent over 3 decades in the law enforcement and criminal justice fields with an emphasis on policy research and communications. Throughout his career, Kevin has also worked for the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, the Chicago Police Department, and the Metropolitan Police Department, and the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Kevin has also served as an Assistant Surgeon at Arms for the United States Senate. Kevin is joined today with Madeline Sloan, and she joined PERF as a Senior Research Assistant in June 2017. Prior to coming to PERF, Madeline served as a police officer in Charleston, South Carolina. Additionally, she has worked with the Charleston Police Fund's Illumination Project, which was an initiative to strengthen relationships between citizens and the police. She's a certified international crime prevention specialist and a security assessment specialist through the International Society of Crime Prevention Practitioners and the American Crime Prevention Institute. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kevin Morrison.
Well, thank you very much, Tanya, and thanks so much to BJA NTEC for giving us this opportunity to present during this webinar this afternoon. Also want to thank the participants and hope that the next 55 minutes or so will be a valuable experience for us. And I know Madeline and I look forward to learning from you as well during the Q&A portion. You know, we know what we know, and we're going to present that today, but I know that many of the people on the line today have expertise that goes beyond what we know, and so we look forward to that dialogue to the extent that we can. Here's a quick look at the agenda for today. We've gone through the welcome and introductions. Madeline and I are going to tag team here until about 2:40 or 2:45. We'll see how long it goes, and then reserve some time at the end for Q&A through the webinar portal, as Tanya pointed out. So let's jump right into it. Real quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with PERF or the Police Executive Research Forum, a quick primer on who we are. You know, we are a national membership organization founded just over 40 years ago, really with the thought of looking at some of the issues that were affecting larger city police departments at the time. It was 10 police chiefs who got together and said, you know, we should get an organization that looks at these issues and tries to look at them from a sort of different, unique, perhaps more progressive standpoint. And so that's how PERF started. From those 10 members, we've grown to about 3,000 police chiefs, sheriffs, other law enforcement leaders, academics, government officials, a whole range of people, and that's really the strength of our organization is that we are a membership organization. We have a board of directors that's elected by our members. Chief Scott Thompson of the Camden County, New Jersey Police Department is our current president. Other board members are the chief executives of the New York City Police Department, Philadelphia, Tucson, Tempe, Clearwater, Florida, Volusia County, Florida, and the Metropolitan Police of London. We also have a research advisory board that helps guide us in a lot of our research. That's chaired by Dr. Charles Welford of the University of Maryland. You know, we list there the things we do: research, policy development, management services, working with agencies, looking at their policies and procedures, executive search capabilities, and also something called the Senior Management Institute for Police, which is a 3-week executive leadership development program that we run each summer, 4 sessions, close to 350 up-and-coming leaders in the policing profession at Boston University. So a range of things that PERF does. I think one of the things that we do is we pride ourselves on listening to our members, listening to the field, trying to spot emerging or important issues as they're bubbling up, and then delving into those issues and looking at them and sharing what we discovered with the field. And that's really what brings us to today's session as well, because it was sort of that MO that we followed for this report on the changing nature of crime and criminal investigations. PERF had looked at tech issues before. For example, in 2013, we had a report on the use of social media in criminal investigations and tactical considerations for the use of social media. So, and done some other things in the technology and crime field before. But what we were really hearing, a year or two ago was that technology was really fundamentally and dramatically starting to change the crime landscape in the United States and really around the world. We heard about street gangs that weren't relying solely on dealing drugs on street corners, but moving into more sophisticated schemes to fund their operations through cybercrime or other financial fraud approaches. Also seeing and hearing about sort of new actors in the crime field, if you were people who not necessarily affiliated with a gang or any criminal enterprise, but figuring out that using technology they could get into the world of drug dealing, cybercrime, and other things as well. And I think that the key thing we heard is that agencies felt they were having challenges in trying to understand what was going on and keep up with those challenges. So that's really what brought us to delve into this subject. We, as we do on all of these type of projects, we conducted some background research on what was going on. We convened a meeting in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2017 that brought together about 200 police chiefs and experts in criminal investigation, technology, police operations, and the like. We listened to them, during the day. What does the problem look like? What needs to be done? What is being done? What's creative, and the like? And then we published a report based on our research and the convening, and that's the report that you see here from January 2018. I will say that this report is part of PERF's what we call our Critical Issues in Policing series. This is a series of reports dating back well over 15 years. This was, I think, our 34th or 35th publication in this series, generously supported by the Motorola Solutions Foundation. But so that's a little bit of background on PERF and the project. I'm going to turn it over to Madeline to sort of get into some of the nuts and bolts on what we discussed and what we learned during our research and during our meeting.
We'll begin by talking a bit about the current crime landscape in the United States. So as measured by traditional reporting systems, crime in the U.S. has declined sharply in recent decades. So from 1993 to 2015, the violent crime rate dropped by over 50%, and during that same time frame, the property crime rate decreased by nearly 48%. So although we're seeing a decrease in property crimes and violent crimes, there has been an exponential increase in computer-enabled or technology-enabled crimes. So for instance, total internet crime complaints, which are fielded by IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, increased about 14% between 2013 and 2016. So that resulted in nearly 300,000 internet crime complaints. And the FBI also estimates that for every one crime that is reported, there's about 6 that are not reported. The total monetary losses associated with those crimes have also increased as well. They've surpassed about $1.4 billion in 2016, and because so many of those crimes are underreported, the total costs may approach about $10 billion per year. Identity theft has also been on the rise as well. In 2016, the Federal Trade Commission received nearly 400,000 complaints of identity theft, and that was about a 59% increase from 2010. And although the number of identity theft victims is large and growing, the crimes are vastly underreported, and fewer than 1 in 10 victims reports the incident to the police. This type of data is collected from 3 sources primarily. The first one is, as I mentioned before, the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center, or IC3, and they accept complaints from victims or third parties who suspect Internet-facilitated criminal activity. The second is the Federal Trade Commission Consumer Sentinel Network, or CSN. They collect consumer complaints filed to the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, and publish that information in an annual report. And in addition, the National Crime Victimization Survey data supplement in 2014 published one-time information about identity theft victimization.
This whole issue around measuring crime and especially computer-enabled crime wasn't, I think, something that we necessarily, when we started this project, thought that was going to be something we delve into. But as we looked at it, it became apparent. Here we were celebrating those dramatic reductions in violent property crime, and yet these other types of crime seem to be, exploding off the charts, and also probably not being accurately measured, as Madeline suggested. Anywhere from only 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 of these types of crimes are being looked at, so are being reported. So one of the things that we did look at was what are the limitations of the current crime measures, and what can be done to sort of better capture these data. There's an old saying that what gets measured gets done, and yet it seems like we're not measuring computer-enabled crime very well. As we looked at it, it was not just a statistical exercise. We want to be able to measure these crimes so that we have numbers. But I think the numbers, the trends, those sorts of things, they help drive policy. They have funding implications, a whole range of things that flow from being able to accurately measure the problem. At the meeting, we had a representative from the panel on modernizing the nation's crime statistics, which actually was a group that I'd never heard of up until we had our meeting. This is a group that's been meeting, looking at UCR, NIBRS, our existing systems, and seeing, how can we improve them. A major focus of their work is, in fact, on better measuring computer-enabled crimes and how we can get a better handle on those. They looked at something from the United Nations called the International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purposes, and in fact have recommended a modified approach to that classification system that they feel, if implemented, would help us better tabulate and be able to analyze these types of crimes. So really kind of a side issue, but I think an important one in terms of how are we measuring computer-enabled crime and what are the implications for us moving forward.
So clearly we know that the landscape of crime has changed, and there's really 2 ways in which that change has occurred. The first way is that criminals are using technology to invent new types of crime. Crime is evolving, new crime is existing that didn't exist several years ago. So a few examples of that, the first is ransomware. And ransomware is a type of online attack that blocks the user's access to his or her computer system until the ransom is paid. And hackers usually ask for a ransom payment in the form of digital currency, for example, Bitcoin. And if that ransom is paid, then the victim will receive a decryption key that will unlock the system. However, if the victim refuses to pay, then the hacker will threaten to delete the files. Police are also falling victim to these types of schemes, and police computers are typically very vulnerable to that type of software because many departments, especially smaller departments, have scarcity of resources and may have outdated systems. Extortion is another example of a new type of crime. And it's a type of online sexual exploitation in which the offender coerces or blackmails victims into providing sexually explicit images or videos of themselves. And those demands often come from the offender's threat to publicly post sexual images or to send them to the victim's friends or family. And another example is synthetic identity theft. And that occurs when a criminal obtains a social security number, which is typically from a child, and then they'll attach a fake name or address to it and piggyback on another person's credit to establish credit over time. And then as that criminal will build up credit, secure mortgages, and take out loans, they'll then cash them out. Children are especially vulnerable to that type of identity theft since credit reports are not typically run on children. So many of those victims don't discover that their identity has been compromised until they're in their late teens or 20s when they're applying for a student loan or their first credit card, for example. The second way in which crime has evolved is that criminals are now developing new methods to commit traditional crimes. So crimes that have been going on for years, there's just new ways that people are now facilitating them. One example that Kevin had alluded to earlier was drug transactions. We're seeing a shift in drug transactions moving from street corners to now web-based dark markets, and there's an exchange of digital currency. It's very difficult to quantify the extent of that illegal activity taking place on the dark web, but in 2016, the RAND Corporation did do a study and estimated that across 8 major dark web marketplaces, the revenue from illegal drug sales could be as high as about $25 million per month. Another thing to note is that the dark web does still account for a relatively small share of the total drug sales, especially with drugs such as cocaine and marijuana. However, with synthetic opioids such as fentanyl and U4, a lot of these are being sold over the dark web. Also seeing a shift in gang activity. It's moving from traditional violent crimes to more elaborate fraud schemes. A great example of this is a case involving the Van Dyke money gang, which happened out of New York City. 12 members of the Van Dyke money gang who ranged in age from about 20 to 30. They were found guilty, and they had fraudulently obtained different blank postal money orders. They would take a relatively small dollar amount, typically under $1,000 on the money orders, and then would recruit bank account holders to deposit the fraudulent money orders into their own accounts. So once the account holders withdrew the money, they would turn the money back over to the gang members. The scheme involved a total of 350 bank accounts across New York, Massachusetts, and DC, and it cost more than $1.5 million. So why is this shift occurring? There's a few reasons that we found. The first is that it's simply less dangerous. Moving things from street corners to the dark web just puts less of a threat on the individuals. It also yields higher profits, and there's often lower penalties as well. Violent crimes have longer sentencing most of the time than these different fraud schemes. Theft has also evolved. Of course, we're all familiar with the use of credit card skimmers, in which different card readers will be attached to devices such as gas pumps or ATM machines. The skimmer is attached to these machines and then captures the data from the card's magnetic strip every time a consumer uses their card. This has also evolved recently. There's newer types of these devices called shimmers or slimmers. Those are starting to pop up as well from what we're hearing from our law enforcement executives. In these cases, the shimmer or slimmer will use radio frequency identification information, which is stored in the chips of modern credit, debit, and ATM cards, and then using the Bluetooth technology will transmit the information wirelessly. The last thing I want to mention is the evolution of theft from motor vehicles. So as anti-theft measures have become more sophisticated, criminals have adopted new technologies to circumvent them. So for example, car burglars are now using jamming devices to disrupt a signal preventing a car from locking. So for instance, as the victim will walk away from his or her car and attempts to lock it with a key fob, the thief will then use that jamming device, which disrupts the signal. After the owner walks away, the criminal can then enter the car and steal any valuables that were left inside. Also, there's a shift in what thieves are actually interested in taking from the vehicles. So traditionally, we've seen trends from taking valuables such as radios from vehicles. However, we're hearing from our law enforcement community that they're seeing vehicle registration and insurance cards being taken from the vehicles instead. And that's usually because the criminal will use the identifiable information to then commit identity theft and fraud. So as this crime has changed, that has introduced new investigatory challenges for law enforcement. The digital evidence, for instance, has a certain characteristics that present many challenges for police in modern criminal investigations. First, it's broad in scope, and by that I mean that there's a wide range of devices that can contain digital evidence, for example, smartphones, laptops, GPS systems, or Fitbits. And because there's so many different types of devices that hold digital evidence, there's not really a uniform process to obtain that information. Digital evidence is also very difficult to obtain, and I'll talk about this in one moment, but there's issues with encryption and relying on third-party tech companies to gather that info. Also, there's just a large volume of data. To paint the picture for you, by 2020, the number of internet-connected devices is expected to reach an average of 4.3 devices per person, which equates to about 33 billion devices worldwide. So as there's more devices, that means that there's more data, and it's difficult for investigators to distinguish the signal from the noise. Digital evidence also creates a demand for new skill sets. Because every crime has a digital component, there's more of a demand and a need for investigators and officers to receive training on how to identify and how to recover this digital evidence. Encryption and going dark also presents a very unique set of challenges for investigators. Most obviously, there's a hindered access to evidence. So as new encryption technology restricts data access solely to the user, even with the assistance of service providers and a court order, police may not be able to access that encrypted data. One good example of that is in 2014 when Apple announced that it could no longer extract data from devices running on iOS 8 and later versions. Other companies also followed suit, such as Google and Facebook. Criminals are also catching on to this trend. Law enforcement leaders are reporting that gangs are now communicating through encrypted messaging systems such as Skype and WhatsApp. So even in situations where police might have wiretap orders, they're unable to intercept these communication exchanges. Lack of cooperation from tech companies also is a concern. And while many police departments do have positive working relationships with certain tech companies, others have certainly faced resistance to data requests despite having followed the proper legal procedures. For instance, delays. Some companies are taking a substantial amount of time to provide the requested data, even if the case is time sensitive. Secondly, coded data is also a concern. So although the tech companies may be required to surrender the data, there's no laws or standards governing how that data is presented. So companies are able to provide jumbled or coded data to the police in response to the records request, which is essentially useless unless the police have a method to decode that. Another concern is suspect notification. Many of the tech companies have policies that require them to notify users when the individual's device is subject to seizure by the police, and undoubtedly that can be a concern for investigators because it can tip off criminals and give them time to destroy critical evidence. The third area of challenges is from courtroom actors. So as the technology continues to evolve, judges may not be able to keep up and understand the technology fully. And that's a concern because, like all warrants and subpoenas, requests for digital evidence must be approved by a judge as well. So if they don't have expertise in the area, it can be problematic for investigators. For example, a judge might want to grant a warrant, but say police cannot search the whole phone. But unfortunately, the technology is designed so that you cannot perform a forensic dump on a phone by only taking a few things. You have to extract all of the data and sort through it. The second thing that we've heard is the CSI effect. Essentially, juries are now expecting digital evidence in every case, and they're also expecting those investigative technologies to work flawlessly every time because television dramas portray the technologies that way. So as a result, jurors may be suspicious of a prosecution if it fails to present extremely high levels of digital evidence. So just as criminals have used technology to perpetrate crime, investigators are also using technology as a new way to investigate these criminal offenses. For instance, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media applications have become an essential investigative tool for police agencies. Social media can be used to collect evidence, locate suspects, and identify criminal networks. While some offenders may use social media to facilitate crimes, others will actually post incriminating evidence about crimes they have been involved in. So for instance, there was a case out of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the victim was viciously beaten and robbed, and a video of the attack was uploaded to Facebook and Instagram. The police were then able to use that as evidence to prosecute the suspect. Because many people don't use the privacy controls on their social media accounts, to limit who sees their postings, many times police can gather this information without a search warrant. Mobile applications are also growing in nature. For example, navigation apps, social networking, apps for shopping or banking. So police investigators are increasingly turning to suspects' use of mobile apps to trace their location and their activities. And they're becoming a very rich source of investigative information for police agencies. Internet of Things devices, or IoT devices, refer to the network of digital objects that transmit data using embedded sensors. A few examples of IoT devices are Fitbits, Amazon Echoes, or home security systems that are connected to the internet. A great example of police using these IoT devices for evidence is a case out of Seattle. The Seattle PD used data from a Fitbit during an investigation of an attempted sexual assault. While the victim was on a run, they stopped at a park to use the restroom where she was attacked by the suspect. The victim was able to fight the suspect off with help of a witness, but police used the data from the Fitbit to map out the victim's movements for the jury, which helped prosecute the case. Other innovations have also been of a support to investigators. For instance, Bluetooth in cars. So when cell phones are connected to vehicles via Bluetooth, data from the phone, including call logs, may be stored in the vehicle. If a smartphone is connected to the car via Bluetooth, police may be able to extract the information through the car, even if the phone is inaccessible or locked. So that's been a workaround for many police agencies who have faced issues with encryption. Some digital devices automatically attempt to connect to nearby Wi-Fi signals, which also can be a strong investigative tool for police. Again, a case out of Fayetteville, North Carolina, the police knew that they were investigating a shooting and knew that the suspect's vehicle was stopped at a certain intersection around the time of the crime. So they tracked the movement of the vehicle driving down the street as devices within the car automatically connected to the free Wi-Fi from nearby stores. The investigators were able to identify the suspect by seeing who had connected to the Wi-Fi of a particular store that was near the intersection during the same time that the suspect's car was in the area. And lastly, there's now canines that can detect digital media. There's chemicals used in digital media, thumb drives and disks, that dogs can recognize through trace chemicals. The New Jersey State Police had a child pornography case where they used a canine to find a thumb drive and other media that was concealed behind a wall.
Great, thanks, Madeline, for that sort of overview of some of the key things that we looked at in our report and that came up in our meeting. To try to bring some of those things together, I want to sort of briefly go through a case study, and we had the individuals who worked on this case come to our meeting and walk us through it, and it really was a kind of an eye-opening experience in terms of how you know, the changing nature of how this particular crime was committed, the tools that investigators used to help solve that crime, and then how they combine those you know, sort of more sophisticated technological tools with some good old-fashioned police work to ultimately bring this case to a closure. The case study is called Peter the Great, and you'll understand that in a minute. But it involves a tragic drug overdose death involving an 18-year-old woman in Portland, Oregon, in February of 2017. You know, sadly, she was one of about 72,000 individuals in the United States who died of a drug overdose that year. Approximately 60,000 of those involving heroin or synthetic or semi-synthetic opioids. To their credit, the Portland Police Bureau has instituted a policy such that they investigate all overdose deaths as potential homicide cases. You know, I think it's a relatively new phenomenon we're seeing with police departments, but a critically important one where they look at these cases as more than just, okay, here's another overdose, sort of check the box death investigation. In Portland's case, they really try to delve in and try to figure out if they can determine where this individual got those drugs from, and if they can go back upstream and look to potentially prosecute individuals. So in this case, they responded. The investigators in Portland responded to the victim's apartment, and were you know, pretty quickly able to determine that the drugs seemed like they'd been shipped through the mail. There was a variety of both physical evidence and, as you'll see, digital evidence that they collected in that initial scan of the apartment. One of the things they determined was there was a pregnancy test kit there, and it was a kind that happened to be sold only at Dollar Tree stores, and that seemed unusual because it was next to a mailing envelope that had a fictitious return address, but that investigators working with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service were able to determine that the mailing envelopes were actually sold in Greenville, South Carolina. So that was a key clue right there that sort of broadened the geographic footprint of this crime. They also discovered on a notepad in the victim's apartment an alphanumeric code called PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy Key. And as they delved into the dark web aspect of this investigation, that became critically important. Portland police, as they began this investigation, turned to a group called Immigration and Customs Enforcement Homeland Security Investigations. And I think one of the things interesting things that came out of our meeting was that a lot of police agencies, frankly, hadn't heard about HSI, didn't know their capabilities, and through this case study and other discussions, really learned that they're kind of a hidden gem in this whole arena, and have tremendous expertise and experience in these types of incidents. In fact, I distinctly remember us asking the Portland police officials, well, how did you know about HSI? And they said, well, they're right down the hall. They're actually embedded or housed in the Portland Police Department, and that kind of partnership that already had been established long before this particular investigation began proved to be critically important. So using the victim's PGP key, the investigators were able to determine that she had in fact purchased the drugs on a dark website called Alphabay, and they also determined that the seller's username was Peter the Great, hence the name of the case study. And they were able to quickly determine that Peter the Great had been linked to nearly 10,000 drug transactions on that particular site. So again, using the expertise and the guidance from ICE HSI, detectives went online and were able to purchase the U4 synthetic opioid from Peter the Great. They determined that the drugs arrived wrapped in the same pregnancy kit and containing the same type of shipping labels that they had found in Aisha's apartment. So that that linked, their shipments with the ones they discovered there. Postal inspectors also determined that the shipping labels came from a company that accepted only Bitcoin. Obviously, all these transactions on the dark web taking place in Bitcoin. Further investigation discovering secure email addresses that were linked to the shipping label purchase. They filed a subpoena to take a look at those, and that was really the key that led them to the person of interest, Theodore Kleberod, who was in fact living in Greenville, South Carolina. Detectives then were able to determine that he had received numerous international packages from China, where a great deal, as Madeline said earlier, a great deal of U4 and other synthetic opioids are found. And here again, an important consideration on the social media aspect is, as Madeline pointed out, trying to find linkages with Theodore Kleberod. They determined that he was in a relationship with a woman named Anna Barrero, so an important key there. Next, investigators went to the Dollar Tree store. Remember, the pregnancy kit was sold only at the Dollar Tree store, so they went there and were able to collect other pieces of key evidence, a spike in sales of those particular pregnancy kits, and then store video showing Ms. Barrero's purchasing those kits at that time. At this point, Portland officials traveled to Greenville, and with the assistance of the Greenville Police Department, began surveillance of both the suspects. They witnessed them, mailing packages, out from the post office there. Again, packages that matched the ones that they found in the store. By April of 2017, which was just about 3 months after the overdose death, officers arrested Kleberod and Barrero and faced serious federal drug charges and potential additional charges in South Carolina and Oregon. Investigators, going further in this investigation, think that Peter the Great may have been connected to more than a dozen overdose deaths across the country. Just a little update on that. Kleberod actually committed suicide in jail as he was waiting a trial, and Barrero was recently convicted and sentenced to a pretty long prison sentence as well. Real quickly, because we asked the folks from Portland and from ICE HSI, what were the key takeaways from this particular investigation? And a few of them were that police and prosecutors need to develop a working knowledge of the dark web and the use of cryptocurrency. The police don't need to be experts in that. There are people like ICE HSI that you can turn to and others, but that at least a working knowledge of how the dark web works and how cryptocurrency works is important. Second thing is agencies need to form these partnerships. I talked about that earlier, but if they're going to collect the digital evidence from the dark web, local, state, and federal agencies need to have that working relationship, need to be willing to share information, resources, and expertise. And this particular case, again, was a great example of how all those things came together. And I think the third important takeaway that they said is that these new technology-based approaches to criminal investigations are important, but they've still got to be combined with that traditional investigative work that's thorough and detailed. And you saw that through collection of surveillance video and in-person surveillance and looking for and matching physical evidence. All those things came together in this particular case. We've got a few more slides that we'll go through kind of quickly. One thing we like to do in our reports is, in addition to sort of presenting the issues, is provide some takeaways to agencies. So we've got 9 steps that we think police agencies can take to improve their effectiveness in this new world of computer-enabled crime and investigation. So we'll go through these pretty quickly, but Madeline, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So the first step that we identified was that police agencies need to evolve, and they need to do so fairly quickly. As crime continues to change, that means law enforcement agencies must change as well, and that means rethinking organizational models that reflect traditional silos. So for instance, units that investigate gangs should have financial crime experts who are adept at finding the source of gang funding, which are increasingly connected with cybercrime.
The second step we had dealt with personnel, that agencies need to attract and retain people who have skills to operate effectively in this new environment. And you know, in some cases it'll be people who already have those skills, or people who can easily be trained in the skills that are needed. We heard the growing use of not just officers and detectives, but also analysts who are often civilians in agencies, that's critically important as well. Retention in this area, we heard, was a really big challenge because people get expertise in these specialized areas, and folks in the private sector often woo them. So agencies really need to think about how can they not just attract the personnel they need, but also retain them.
The third step relates to training. Agencies need to continuously train and retrain their employees on issues related to computer-enabled crime. And we have identified several free or low-cost training programs, which we'll address at the end of the presentation.
The fourth thing has to do with the dark web, and we sort of talked about this earlier, that you know, as crimes move from street corners to the internet, agencies need to develop that working knowledge. That was one of the dark web and cryptocurrency. Again, that was one of the takeaways that the folks from Portland brought to the meeting. The important thing here, I think, is the realization that agencies can't just jump into the dark web and begin an investigation. They really need to understand how it works and how they can safely and effectively operate. You know, we heard you know, examples of police personnel inadvertently revealing their identities on the dark web because they didn't take the necessary precaution, or the possibility of one agency you know, accidentally cutting across another investigation by another agency. So that sort of deconflicting your investigations and operating safely on the dark web is critically important.
Local police agencies should also be leveraging partnerships with federal, state, and other local law enforcement agencies. Again, going back to the Peter the Great case study from Portland that Kevin had mentioned, I think that case is key in highlighting the partnerships with Homeland Security Investigations and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service.
The sixth takeaway has to do with what small and mid-sized agencies can do. You know, Portland obviously is a major city, and the case, the Van Dyke money gang case that Madeline referred to earlier came out largely out of New York City and D.C. and other major cities. But the reality is that these crimes cut across jurisdictional boundaries and size of organizations as well. And in fact, in many cases, smaller jurisdictions are being disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic and overdoses resulting from that. Another challenge is that in big cities, oftentimes have the resources or have the federal partners right on site, so it's easier for them. The challenge really is in small to mid-sized agencies. How do they effectively navigate this new landscape? So you know, what we talked about here was, you know, forming compacts with larger departments and state agencies, you know, regional task forces, if you will. One example in the San Diego region, more than 80 agencies are sharing licenses for software that can be expensive, but that facilitates information sharing, crime analysis, facial recognition, high-tech solutions. So, you know, state and local agencies are also creating regional computer forensics labs and regional fusion centers to assist with digital forensics.
Investigators are also facing a lot of legal and privacy issues, especially in working with technology companies. And again, we have identified several helpful resources, which I'll address on our resources slide at the end.
Number 8 here is and Madeline got to this earlier, the need for police to educate other players in the criminal justice system. You know, we heard that nothing frustrates the police more than putting together a strong, complex case, but only to see that fall apart because the prosecutor, the judge, or the juries don't quite understand, you know, how this new world of computer-enabled crime works, what digital evidence is like, and how it is effective and might not be 100% effective when you're talking with juries and that whole CSI effect. So really we talked about the policing profession, the law enforcement profession in general needs to work with those other players in the criminal justice system, prosecutors, courts, and the public to really set expectations and bring them up to speed on how these how this new world of crime is operating.
And the ninth step is integrating new and old investigative techniques. And again, Kevin touched on this in the Peter the Great case study. To be successful, law enforcement agencies need to integrate new technology-driven approaches to criminal investigations, but also doing so with traditional investigative techniques. Even in the most complex investigations, there's still traditional investigative work that will be required. And as I mentioned, we've put together a few resources for you all today that hopefully will be helpful in overcoming some of the challenges that we discussed. First, I'll just go through a few free or low-cost training programs. First is the National White Collar Crime Center, or NW3C. They have great training. Most of it's available online. They also do have some in-person training sessions as well. And that covers topics on cyber investigations, cyber security, and financial crime. But they also do have training for prosecutors as well. Secondly, the U.S. Secret Service National Computer Forensics Institute, or NCFI, provides training on digital forensics and high-tech investigations for state and local police officers at no charge. And lastly, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC, has basic incident response to digital evidence training and also digital evidence acquisition specialist training. And those are just a few examples. They do have more extensive curriculum as well. A few other helpful resources, and this has a lot to do with the discussion on the encryption and cooperation among tech companies. The first is from Search, which is a nonprofit that's partially funded from the Office of Justice Programs, or OJP. They have an Internet Service Provider, or ISP list, which essentially is a database of ISP providers. And for each ISP, there's a list of legal contact information, as well as instructions needed to serve subpoenas, court orders, and search warrants. Secondly, they have a quick access ISP information. Through a simple online request form, Search will provide investigators with documents to aid in data requests to ISPs, and some of those files include legal process policies and law enforcement compliance guides for popular tech companies. Second is the National Domestic Communications Assistance Center, or NDCAC, and that is organized under the Department of Justice. They maintain a database with documents to aid in data requests to ISPs, and those files include point of contact information and search warrant templates for over 100 different applications. And lastly, the Department of Justice Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, or CSIP, they assist law enforcement with the preservation of overseas data. They also operate a 24/7 service line for situations that are urgent. Oh, and lastly, I want to mention the Law Enforcement Cyber Center. The LECC is managed by the BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and it essentially serves as a web page that is a repository with searchable training opportunities and for executives, officers, and prosecutors. And we have the link there. It's www.iacpcybercenter.org. So you'll find a lot of information. In addition to the resources listed on the slide, there's also a lot of great resources available on that website as well. So I certainly encourage you to check that out.
Well, that really brings us to the end of our prepared remarks here. You've got contact information for Madeline and myself. Our report, The Changing Nature of Crime and Criminal Investigations, is available on our website there. That's the full URL. You can just go to policeforum.org and pull down box for online publications. Pretty much all of PERF's publications are available free of charge to anybody. You don't need to be a PERF member to access our reports, but that report is there. If you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to take a look at it. If you have comments, thoughts, whatever, please feel free to reach out to Madeline or myself. So with that, we'll end the prepared presentation and I guess turn it back over.
Thank you so much to Kevin and Madeline for their very informative presentation. We do have about 9 minutes, and I know Kevin and Madeline are willing to stay on the line to answer a few questions. So as a reminder, we encourage anyone who wants to send us a question, please use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. So I'll give it a minute to see if anybody has any questions. Hi, Kevin and Madeline. We do have a few questions that just came in. The first question is there a preferred or recommended list of training skills I should start with?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I think probably going to those resources and seeing what they have to offer. But I think we touched on some of them. The understanding the dark web, understanding social media investigations, Internet of Things, mobile apps, those sorts of things I think are important. And anything else, Madeline?
I would also encourage you to think beyond just your investigators. For example, when officers are responding to a scene, it's important for them to be able to identify and do an initial preservation of digital evidence. So some of training on those topics are available from those different resources that I mentioned. For example, the National White Collar Crime Center has training on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because if I recall in that Peter the Great case, one of the key things was finding that alphanumeric code, that PGP code that was just written on a notepad. Had they not seen that, they probably never would have they might have suspected that was the drugs were purchased over the dark web, but they wouldn't have had as easily that entry code, or that entryway to the investigation. So again, training all of your people in some of the basic skills. Again, they don't have to be, every patrol officer on your force doesn't have to be an expert in dark web or Bitcoin, but at least a little bit of knowledge to be on the lookout and understanding, what may be there in terms of digital evidence.
The next question I have is a question about whether or not there are other model programs or cities
that have done this well.
Actually, in referring to the changing nature of crime and criminal investigations report, we do have a few different case studies on different topic areas. So I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that report and to get a better understanding. We do walk more detailed through different cases from different jurisdictions.
Yeah, there was the Vanderbilt rape case, right? That was a fairly famous one that relied on cell phone
digital evidence,
messages and photos. I don't think there's necessarily one particular agency or set of agencies that completely figure this thing out, but there are certainly case studies covered in our report and probably elsewhere of agencies that have done a good job of applying some of the things we talked about to help solve cases.
Since this presentation is about technology, is there any resources or trainings that you know of that the folks on the webinar might be interested so they can get more computer skills besides just a standard college degree to do this type of work?
That's a great question, and we'll pull up that resources slide again. I think that the resources that we've listed here, from what we've identified and heard from the experts in the field, are a really good starting point.
Wonderful.
You know, what are the types of things like the National White Collar Crime Center?
Right, so the National White Collar Crime Center, again, they do have training online, which is very useful. Low cost and more accessible, but they also do have in-person training as well, and they do cover training on topics on cyber investigations, cyber security, and financial crime, as well as offer training to prosecutors, and there's certainly a demand for that. Those are just a few of the topics, but that would probably be my recommendation as the best starting point, would be the National White Collar Crime Center.
I do have a few more questions, and I do want to note and be cognizant of time too, with only 3 more minutes, so we might not be able to get to everyone's questions today. So as a reminder, you can definitely reach out to Kevin and Madeline with their contact information at the end, on the slide at the end of this presentation. So I have a few more questions. This question is about how much of the criminal investigation work is outsourced to private contractors, consultants, private businesses, as opposed to being done in-house?
That's a really good question. I think from the experts that we spoke to during the August 2017 conference, which is the conference that informed most of this report, most of this work, and I think it's just the nature of the content of the investigations, it really is housed within the agency. One example that I can think of where contracting outside sources, a big case was the San Bernardino shooting. In that case, it was encryption issues with the cell phone, and I know that the FBI took over that case, and they did end up contracting with a private vendor to gain access to that encrypted device. However, I would say that's probably an anomaly. Most agencies are really resorting to their own investigative tools and training to navigate those challenges.
All right. I just want to thank Kevin, Madeline again from PERF to join us today for this webinar. And thank you to all who joined us today for our presentation. And just to let everyone know, sometime next week, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a copy of today's presentation, along with a survey. And we would appreciate if you all can respond to that for us. Please have a great rest of your afternoon.